more interdisciplinary expertise to our topic. And I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Mark Bartlett, who has made a career of looking at how to return people to health, but keep them there in prevention. He is currently the Chief Science Officer with an innovative company called Make Wellness. And you can see in his bio that he's both master's and doctorally prepared in the area of immunology and cell biology. He has in the past been a research scientist with a couple of different organizations. And he's going to move us into nutrition and exercise and their role in brain health. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, this might be superficial, but it's the last talk of the day, right? And it's kind of funny because I'm not a nutritionist or an exercise physiologist or any of those things, but I do have a perspective that I think might be interesting. Today I've heard some amazing things, and so have you. Some really in-depth science and medicine, and it's a pity we can't clone all these guys, right? Because why are we here? We're here to try to improve people's lives, change people's lives. And there's only so much we can do as individuals. So I love to see kind of the work that's going on that's training other scientists, publishing things to help it get out there. And over the last 30 years or so, I kind of changed my mission in life. It was like first doing research. And I was doing research sort of in the cancer lab, and I was doing some biochemistry research and cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disease, and people would ask me questions, and I'd be like, "Didn't your doctor tell you that?" Or, it just seems like when it comes to helping people improve their health, part of the gap is that leverage, helping people sort of get the message to them, teaching them, and I really feel like today is a very important day, because innovation really only happens when you have this like interdisciplinary sort of interaction. So hopefully you'll get some ideas from some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today, because I'm always trying to find new things that would help people to sort of stay on the healthy side of the equation. So nutrition, exercise, and brain health, there's a connection there. I'm sure many of you know about it. Some words today like myokines, we'll talk about myokines. Do I have any disclosures? No, I'm not selling peptides at the front door. Not today. This is kind of a spoiler alert, right? Because, all of these things, just read those really quickly. It's kind of like a disclaimer, but let's get right into it. This is a poster that's on my wall in my office. So today, we've heard, I know you're laughing at this, but didn't you already see all those neuronal connections and things? And that was crazy. And it felt like an electronics class, right? All the on and off switches. And then biochemistry is just as crazy. And I love biochemical pathways. But this is more the immune pathways. And when immune cells communicate with each other, they do so through these messengers. They're basically small proteins and peptides that, if you maybe get bacteria under the skin, then you've got sort of first line of defense. Maybe you've got macrophages that say, hey, we need to recruit some B cells and T cells. So there's all this communication that's going on. And it has grown and grown. And so when I started doing immunology about 40 years ago, I think we knew maybe a tenth of what we know now about those messages, and it just gets confusing. But the take-home message is that there are small proteins and peptides that are the communication molecules between the cells when your body is functioning normally. And I'll call it peptide-based communication. And I'm using the word peptide loosely because peptides are strings of amino acids, and the definition of a peptide or a polypeptide is kind of about less than 100 amino acid residues, and then bigger than that is a protein. But a lot of these are small proteins and peptides that are communicating. And they have shape. Some of them actually in their primary structure, they're like a lock and key. So think of a receptor, and maybe you have an amino acid sequence. Maybe there are 10 amino acids residues in this little peptide. But there are positively charged, negatively charged, maybe some hydrophilic amino acids, some hydrophobic amino acids. They're just like a lock that fits into a key, And you can find those interactions that then stimulate the receptor and get a result. But we can think about them as text messages between the cells, but actually it's more like Snapchat. Do you know the difference? Anyone hip, cool here? Like the Snapchat is like you send a message and then it dissolves, it disappears, so your parents can't see that you're like buying cigarettes, right? That's how it works, right? So let's think about that in terms of, sort of everyone's thinking about peptides right now. Why? What's the first peptide you think of? Yeah, hormones. I'm thinking like things like Ozempic, right? Like insulin has been around for 110 years or so. It wasn't really such a hot peptide. I think people didn't even know it was one, right? It's about 50 amino acids. But now it's Ozempic, like it's a GLP-1 receptor agonist, right? Now let's think about the body. What happens when you eat food? You eat humans are always hungry, right? It's evolutionary built into us. You're like hungry all the time. Like we just ate dinner last night with my daughter up in Pleasanton, and I get home and I'm like, open the fridge, is there any more food in there? Like it is so ingrained. What goes on when you eat then? When you eat, the L cells in your gut detect macronutrients and say, you don't need to eat anymore. You don't need to go hunting for food. It actually produces GLP-1. And GLP-1 is this little peptide that then goes to the brain and to the other organs to say, hey, slow down the food hunting. It also says slow down the gut emptying, and sends messages to the rest of the body, like the pancreas for insulin and things like that. So how long, I'm going to ask you a question, how long does that little peptide last before it is dissolved by peptidases? Anyone have an idea? The half-life of GLP-1. It's about 2 minutes. Yeah, and then it's destroyed. So the body has to keep making it. So it's Snapchat, right? I'll give you an example like Ozempic, which is a synthetic kind of, you've sort of doctored the sequence a little bit so that it will survive in the body without being destroyed. How long does that last? What's the half-life? Anyone know? 7 days, right? So, I mean, that's why you only have to get an injection once a week. But we'll talk a little bit later about the consequences of that. But these peptide communication is really quite amazing. So I want to, here's kind of where I'm going today. Think about an endocrine organ that you know of. Pancreas, right. Pancreas, what does that produce? Insulin, anything else? Breast. Oh, okay. Maybe it does, I don't know. I'm not an endocrinologist. I understand that there are about 5, right? About 5 different peptide, basically hormones that it produces. Any other endocrine organs that you know of? There's the thymus. Yes, the adrenals, pituitary. They're all kind of famous for like 3 to 5 sort of hormones that they produce, right? And now we think of the muscle. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of a history of the muscle. Pre-1990s, it was all about your muscle is really basically the forklift of your body. It's doing the work. That's about all it does, right? It gets me from point A to point B. I can lift stuff. And then we started to see that there was a connection between cytokines and muscles. In the 90s, they say, when you contract the muscle, it's actually excreting things. But at first they thought, it's probably just waste products. And then around the year 2000, it was a landmark year. So Peterson from the University of Copenhagen coined this term myokines to describe basically cytokines, the same thing that the immune cells were doing, but they're coming from the muscle. And then 2003 to 2005, they started to identify them. There's IL-15, LIF, BDNF, which we've heard of right today, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So now we're thinking, wait, it doesn't just come from the brain. Maybe that should be MDNF, because it's coming from the muscle here, and others, right? So then we really started to become interested in the muscle-fat sort of crosstalk and muscle-liver crosstalk. So it started to develop. Now you see my muscle is, the brain is lifting things. 2010s, exercise-induced BDNF from muscle is starting to sort of be studied for its impact on neuroplasticity and cognition and other things. So wait a minute, now you've got the brain, muscle-brain connection here. Next slide. Oh, here, sort of the last two phases. Okay, not muscle as machinery anymore, but actually muscle as an endocrine organ. And this is kind of game-changing, right? Because we've talked about some of the endocrine organs. How many myokines, which are the muscle-derived peptides and communication molecules, how many do you think there are? There are around 500 that we know of. So the muscle now is kind of, I think we can safely reclassify it as an endocrine organ. And it's a very powerful endocrine organ that is excreting, releasing all sorts of myokines. Now we have a term called exokines. Have you heard of those? So this is like another term, it's even broader. Whenever you're doing physical activity, then different organs, not just the muscle, are producing these peptide messengers. They're going all over the body and communicating with the body and helping maintain sort of homeostasis, basically. So this is kind of fun because you guys are all in the medical profession, but you're so expert at what you do in all these different areas. It's kind of fun to see that there is stuff that maybe even we don't know, right? So the old view is that the muscle is just an engine for work. The new view is really that muscle is an endocrine organ. And so now we start to see muscle as something that may be far more valuable than just doing the work, being the forklift. Over 600 different myokines for whole body health and especially the brain. So here's just a short list. I should throw up the list of 500 or 600, but I'll just start with a few here, right? So myostatin. Of all of the different myokines, myostatin is kind of interesting and unique and maybe alone, right? Because what it does is it inhibits muscle growth and prevents hypertrophy. So why would you want that? Actually, think of it from an evolutionary perspective. Like not today, but think of a few hundred years ago, even 100 years ago, you were looking for food everywhere. It was hard to come by. You had to work like a dog to get it. You had to hunt or fish, or you had to grow vegetables. And so muscle is actually quite expensive to maintain. It uses a lot of calories to maintain it. So the body is an amazing accountant. It says if you don't need the muscle, if you're sedentary, then let's release this one myokine called myostatin to degrade the muscle, because you don't need it. Don't use it, lose it. And that way you can sort of use your calories for work and other things. But all the others are kind of interesting, aren't they? BDNF, which we talked about, which primary target is the brain neurons and enhances neuroplasticity and learning, sort of protects the neurons, right? We've got experts in the room far more than me on this. Irisin, that's an interesting one that targets the white adipose tissue and kind of has that beiging effect, the browning effect, so increasing thermogenesis. IL-6 is a super interesting one because if you know about chemokines, cytokines, that's normally pro-inflammatory. But somehow when the muscle releases it due to contraction, it actually helps and it becomes sort of anti-inflammatory and enhances glucose uptake and fat oxidation, and so on. Some of them are actually very paracrine in their activity. So like fibroblast growth factor 21, that one is like, it starts to be excreted by the muscle when you're working, and it actually protects the skin and helps with neovascularization, which we heard about today, wound healing, wound repair, but it's kind of a prehabilitation. So it's not actually, it's waiting because, well, why would it do that? I guess, again, think from an evolutionary biology perspective. If you're working, if you're hunting, your muscles are being used, you may be subject to accident. My wife laughs at me because every time I work in the chicken coop or somewhere, I come in with an owie, right? I mean, when you work hard and you're like, or when you're hunting, you're more likely to injure yourself, fall over, scratch yourself, and so the body is preparing it through these myokines. Interestingly, BDNF, the same way. Look at it from an evolutionary biology perspective. If you're using your muscle, if you're running through the forest or whatever, what are you doing? Your brain needs to be alert for predators, but also to remember the way, like use the landmarks, all of those things. So when I think of this, I think, wow, the body just has an incredible design through thousands and millions of years of evolution, and these myokines are part of that communication network. All right, so muscle mass. Now let's move into this, like, what's the importance of muscle mass? It's extremely important for your metabolic health, right? It is a major source of glucose disposal. So if you don't have much muscle mass, you don't have much of a buffer for metabolic health. That's just one example, but there are dozens, right? Less muscle basically means higher glycemia, glycation, brain damage risk. We understand about glycation, right? If you don't control blood glucose, that glucose then basically forms sticky ends on proteins, which then cause protein cross-linking, which is glycation. And some of you have heard of glycosylation, and I often see, I think, a misuse of the words. Glycosylation means that it is catalyzed by an enzyme. Glycation is just going to happen. In the presence of sugar and protein, glycation will happen. You'll get cross-linking of the proteins, and that's the major reason for the accelerated aging of diabetics, right? Stiffening of the arteries and all those things. So muscle mass is super important for all of these things. And so let's talk about the activity too. Like, just one of my favorite words actually right now is mechanotransduction. So when you use your muscle, actually, even if you're just massaging, you're stretching and squishing the cells, and that is mechanotransduction, and it kind of wakes up those cells, and it helps them to sort of start to excrete myokines and exokines and things like that. So when you're using your muscle, it's actually the physical mechanotransduction that then is doing this. And part of this is telling the muscle, stay. When you use your muscle, you contract your muscle, then these myokines are also coming back into the muscle saying, okay, you have permission to stay, you're being used, inhibit the myostatin and keep growing the muscle, right? So sedentary means myostatin up and it breaks it down. So we need to move. I guess this is the bottom line. It's a pretty simple talk, really. We need to be moving every day. And I think I've heard you guys talk about that today. Keep moving. Super important, especially when it's hardest. Like, if you're on chemotherapy, or if you have one of these neurodegenerative or dementias, it's kind of hard to keep moving, but it's even more important to encourage your patients to keep moving. And this is just kind of average Americans, right? So what is the CDC guideline? 150 minutes a week. What does that look like? That might mean on Monday, a brisk 30-minute walk with your friend or your dog. And then on Tuesday, maybe a 45-minute workout, like upper body, maybe doing some push-ups and some pull-ups, things like that. Then on Wednesday, a bike ride or another brisk walk or a swim. Then on Thursday, have a rest. Yeah, you get a rest every now and then. And then on Friday, maybe a lower body workout. And I love, just air squats. It doesn't really matter how old your patient is. 10 of these, 10 times a day, is going to make a difference. So 150 minutes a week, and yet about 50% of the population have met neither of those, right? And I guess that's understandable. We all get really busy. And so when you're busy and you're not moving, myostatin up, muscle down. And then you lose some of your metabolic health and a lot of other things. So it's really hard to pull diagrams off the internet these days because they're all trademarked or something, and I might get in trouble. So now I've resorted to drawing really crude pictures myself. So here, part of the learning today was okay, what stimulates muscle to stay? So it's not all here, but it's kind of simple. And is that oh, look, there's a pointer on this thing. It's been here the whole time. Nobody wanted your pointer. What was the deal with that? I would have said, yeah, give it to me. Powerful laser. Okay, so here's the muscle. Here's the nucleus of the DNA. And there's this little junction box here called mTOR. Have you guys heard of that? It's the mammalian target of rapamycin. It's got kind of a cool story, right? Because Rapa Nui is this island in the Pacific, we're the Easter Island, right? They discovered a fungus there that has that they developed the drug rapamycin from. Rapamycin is a graft rejection drug, but also it's interesting because you see these people that are on these longevity sort of strategies, and they take rapamycin once or twice a week to promote what we call autophagy, right? Which is where the body cleans itself. The immune system is recruited to go and sort of clean up cancer cells in the rest of the body. So mTOR is kind of an interesting junction box. So here, for example, on the muscle, you have the nutrient receptor. I call it the nutrient receptor. It's basically the leucine receptor. So when you eat protein, it's going to be broken down, and you're going to get released from that. Glutamine is one of the amino acids, and leucine is another. So this is really smart, because the muscle says, I think actually the muscle, not the cancer cell we were talking about earlier, deserves the Nobel Prize for intelligence, right? So I'm going to put my vote in here. The muscle's super smart. It says if you're eating enough protein and you get those amino acids, then you've got the building blocks. You have permission to build. Okay, so send a signal through mTOR to the DNA to make muscle keep muscle. So there's your food, there's your protein, amino acids, the nutrient receptor. I'll talk to you in a minute about how that, as you age, that nutrient receptor kind of fades a little bit, so there are other strategies to kind of kick it into gear. Over here, the growth receptor, and this is kind of a cool one. So this one is mostly activated when you sleep. Deep sleep is the opportunity for your brain then to produce growth hormone that binds to this receptor and says, grow and repair. But there are some peptides actually from nature that can bind to that as well. We'll talk in a minute. So here's your brain sleeping, with the growth factor here. Also going through mTOR. There are other receptors too. The vitamin D receptor is important. There are androgen receptors, right, where testosterone, et cetera, bind. And of course, there's mechanotransduction. So squish those cells when you flex your muscles. That's why I do this all the time. The beach is that way, right? So all those things are important for helping the muscle to stay. You want to send that message, and don't stop using it, or myostatin will tell it to go. All right, which kind of exercise then does what kind of myokine? Actually, all the exercises are really good, but you might be thinking in terms of aerobic, long distance type stuff, or sort of more the weights and the resistance training. And the studies show that they do different things, like load bearing kind of causes a different myokine group to be released. But in general, we need a little bit of both, right? So that's the take-home message. Some resistance training, but also some walking and things like that. I like to ride a bike up a hill. In Utah, we've got lots of mountains. I do a 1,300-foot climb every day on the mountain bike, and that's about 2,000 squats. So I think that's good for you, right? Got to develop that muscle. All right. So we talked about, I think I went the wrong direction here. Okay. Sleep. Let me just go back to sleep for a little bit. My talk is supposed to be on nutrition and brain health. What do you think of when you think of nutrition and exercise? Nutrition and exercise. I think the thing that we forget is the third component, and that is sleep. We're starting to realize now how incredibly important sleep is for, here, maintenance of muscle, but also, especially, for maintenance of brain. And so I really enjoyed the talks that I heard today on the brain. We didn't hear anything about the glymphatic system yet. I know these guys were dying to talk about that. So a quick refresher. How much time have I got left? Okay, awesome. I've got plenty of time. This is fascinating. So first of all, the myokine stuff is really recent, right? 10, 15 years. And so this is really important for you to know, and maybe tell your patients how important this is. This is another area that's really recent. So we all know about the lymphatic system, correct? I guess it's pretty important in traditional Chinese medicine, but we also know, massage. My wife does yoga, and she's really good at inversions. So I'm guessing that's really good at lymphatic drainage, etc. So the lymphatic system is sort of collecting the debris and the antigens and things that have sort of escaped the microcirculation and bringing it back into the circulation. There's all sorts of immune surveillance that's going on there. It's super important for basically cleaning up the body of its toxins and metabolites. But we have known for years that the brain does not have a lymphatic system. And we've wondered, well, how does the brain clean itself? Oh, maybe it just recycles everything inside the brain. It's like a laptop, right? It's like everything is compressed in there and there's not much room. So what happens? What we discovered was actually, I didn't give her credit here, but Majken Nedergaard. I think she's from one of the Nordic countries, Sweden, I think. Anyone heard of her? Okay, she asked that question. And around 2012, doing some sort of imaging studies on mouse brains, discovered something extraordinary. Here's the background. We know that the brain floats in cerebrospinal fluid. And we actually know that there's kind of a pulse of the cerebrospinal fluid, kind of as you're breathing. It's not very strong, but there's kind of a little bit of a pulsing of that, right? Now, when you get into slow wave sleep, right? So you've got sort of light sleep, slightly deeper sleep, and you can measure all this with the electroencephalograph, right? The different waves of sleep. I think I heard that today too. You get into the slowest wave sleep, that is deep sleep. And we should be getting maybe an hour or two of that every night. That deep sleep is the only time that the brain then produces the growth hormones for the muscle. But something else extraordinary happens that Nedergaard found, is that there's now suddenly a tidal wave of cerebrospinal fluid that is pushing through the brain. And in fact, it's only enabled because the brain shrinks a little bit and the perivascular spaces between the veins and arteries opens up and the cerebrospinal fluid can get in there and push out these things that have been building up from the day's activities, whether it's adenosine or all the other metabolites, including amyloid beta, tau proteins, like all this is going on during deep sleep. So we talked about how there's an association in the dementias with tau protein tangles. These are kind of sticky proteins. So imagine a situation where you could clean out the monomers, right, before they become polymers, before they become tangles. I may be oversimplifying this a little bit, but I think the basic message is there and that we're starting to see that sleep and the dementias are very closely associated. And now I think about today, I think, I've got 8 kids. Yeah, Crystal, my wife, is a miracle worker helping me raise these kids. And these kids, like the first batch of kids, were born kind of in the 80s, and they didn't have cell phones, and they didn't have social media, and they didn't have too many issues. Kids today, I think the social media, all that kind of stuff, the devices are, I think, not only causing stress in and of themselves, but preventing sleep, right? Because, at nighttime, melatonin normally rises and makes you feel sleepy. Adenosine rises, right? This is, you've got ATP, ADP, AMP, and then adenosine. That is a signal to your brain that it's time to not rest, but actually sort itself out and deep clean and everything else. So now between caffeine and the phone, I think our kids aren't getting enough sleep. That's going to affect their muscle and their brain cleaning and all sorts of things. So it's something that we face that I don't think we've faced before from an evolutionary perspective. So we really need to pay attention to sleep for some of these things. So now we move into just this third concept today, and it's the concept of prehabilitation. Have you guys heard of that notion before? We often think of like, an elderly person has broken a hip or a bone and they're put into hospital and now, or maybe even for dementia, you've got kind of this rehabilitation or this traumatic brain injury, rehabilitation. Cancer, we treat and then we rehabilitate. I see actually the muscle and maintaining muscle mass as a massive prehabilitation strategy. There's tons of research now that indicates that if you're old and you've had an accident, say, I'm just giving that as an example, or if you've got cancer and you go into hospital, one of the biggest indicators of how fast you're going to recover, or even if you'll get out of hospital alive, is muscle mass. In fact, there's a new study that shows that hand grip strength is one of the greatest predictors of how long you'll live. So whether it's cancer or broken bones or even sort of age-related decline, prehabilitation in terms of your muscle mass is really sort of emerging as a very important concept. So I just want to sort of give a core, here's a core 4, but I've got some more strategies here. right? Protein, I mentioned. If you want to keep your muscle, then make sure that that nutrient receptor is seeing leucine. I mentioned earlier that as you get older, that leucine receptor, so you may be eating good quality protein, but the leucine receptor, which is detecting how much amino acids are in your blood, gets a little bit weak. And so maybe you can do a little bit of help here. HMB is a leucine metabolite. It's been around for a long time, but a couple of grams a day of that is actually anti-catabolic, right, for your muscle. So that helps kind of kickstart that nutrient receptor a little bit. Creatine has been around for a long time. It actually is sort of helping to rephosphorylate ADP to make it to ATP. That actually helps with your brain. Think of your brain as having a battery with 3 cells. So we know that when you lose that first phosphate floppy bond from ATP, that generates energy, right? It's a chemical storage form of energy. In the brain, then it goes to, now it's ADP. And creatine actually helps to replenish the phosphate on that ADP, so it's kind of like giving your brain a little bit of extra battery power. Because ultimately then it's ADP, and then AMP, and then adenosine. And did I mention coffee? What does caffeine do? Do you guys know? There's a receptor in the brain called the adenosine receptor. All the neurologists here can correct me if I'm wrong. This is my understanding, right? That adenosine receptor is brilliant because as the metabolic byproduct of the day's activity, the battery gets very low. So think of now your cell phone's on the last leg of its battery. You've got a whole bunch of adenosine. It binds to the adenosine receptor in the brain, and that tells you you're sleepy. It's time to go to bed. But what do? We drink coffee or Coke. Caffeine is an antagonist to that receptor. So it binds that receptor and prevents the binding of adenosine and artificially keeps you awake. But you need deep sleep. You already know why, right? So there's a lot of things going on. I think caffeine is probably the biggest drug trial that has ever been foisted upon humanity with no controls. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but we probably should stop drinking at about 2 p.m. because its half-life is 5 to 7 hours, and it's preventing you from sleeping. All right, what else? Creatine. Oh, and I mentioned here bioactive peptides. So peptides, I've mentioned Ozempic, I mentioned these other things. They're very potent and powerful communication molecules with the cells. I think we're going to be hearing more and more about it. I think we're going to maybe be hearing 2 things. One, these synthetic ones with the super long half-life, they're acting like drugs. They're shouting at the body. They're keeping those receptors open for a long time. Maybe we need to be careful. But we can actually use techniques to find peptides in nature. We have all been experiencing the benefits of peptides from nature since birth, right? Colostrum is full of peptides from milk that are, defensins and things like that are antibacterial, antiviral, immune supporting. There are peptides actually in nature that can help, and one has been found using AI technique to scan the data, the DNA sequence of lots of different crops, and found in fava bean a really nice peptide, about 10 amino acids long, that binds to that growth factor receptor. So there are some opportunities coming up here that are more naturally supportive in the peptide space, so I really like that. I've already mentioned, here are some of the emerging peptide therapies. And again, I basically gave them to you as a word of caution. Because if we go back to this model here, let's think about, there are some peptides now that you can buy on the web that are experimental use only because they're kind of exploiting this. They're not drugs, so they're not supported by the FDA, but they're not supplements. So you'll see on there, experimental use only, etc. Now think of a peptide, a synthetic peptide, that binds really nicely to this growth receptor here. And so it's going to actually be triggering mTOR first. That's the junction box. Now, a lot of things in nature are actually rhythmic, right? Think of cortisol's up in the morning, goes down at night, melatonin goes up at night. Like there's a lot of circadian rhythm when it comes to the stimulation of the body and the hormones and the peptides. Now, if you chronically upregulate mTOR, then you will get muscle growth. But it will be at the expense of autophagy. Because when mTOR is turned off, then you get the autophagy, right? The cleaning of the body. So we may see, again, just look at it from a biochemistry, immunological perspective, there are, I think, consequences to sort of overriding the body's signals, even with something as powerful or as natural as a peptide. And so that goes for the synthetics that have really long half-lives. So just, I think, a word of caution there. All right, nutrition smart additions, the second page. Vitamin D, there are vitamin D receptors on the cell, so those are nice if you want to keep your muscle. It's probably a good strategy. The omega-3 fatty acids are super important. Whoops. I love omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, DHA, good for the brain. I've heard good for TBI, but also really good for sort of helping maintain lean muscle mass. Leucine, a little extra if you need. I already mentioned HMB. And hydration and stress control are really important too. Hydration is important because the cells, a normal cell, is plump and hydrated, and the hydration level of that cell actually impacts the cell surface membrane. And the cell surface membrane and the fluidity is really important for cell receptor activation. So insulin, for example, is very susceptible to changes in membrane fluidity. So, any kind of oxidative stress that might sort of cross-link some of those phospholipid chains in the cell membrane would actually reduce insulin receptor sensitivity. So I see hydration as a really important way to maintain sort of the best communication between the communication molecules in the body and the cells. And then stress control, a similar thing. Stress will always sort of mess with those communication pathways. So here's the key takeaways then. Muscle equals brain health insurance policy. Super important. It's a really good prehabilitation strategy to better recovery and resilience in all sorts of areas. And then the lifestyle trifecta. Exercise is important, nutrition, but also sleep. We must never forget sleep. And I think that's my last slide. Okay, we've got references. I hope you guys check those out later. And break time, I guess. I'll let someone else announce that. Thanks, everyone. I think we have a question.
Yeah.
Do you recommend what kind of foods and protein is rich in leucine? Like organ meat or red meat, protein, chicken? I
think in general, it's interesting because we're on this path right now in the world where we say, animal protein, it's awesome. And vegan type proteins, plant proteins. So interesting that actually, yes, there is less leucine and some of those muscle growth sort of promoting amino acids in the plant proteins. So you generally think, it's going to be about 60% as effective as animal protein, whether it be whey or something else. So if you are sort of really going down the plant protein path, then consider it to be about 60 or 70% the value of an animal protein. So you can still get all you need from the plant protein, but if you see 10 grams of protein, if it's whey protein, it's 10 grams of protein. If it's if it's vegan type protein, if it's plant protein like pea or something, consider that to be more like 6 grams. So there's a big difference between meat and fish and eggs versus sort of a pea protein or a flax protein or a hemp protein.
So overall, definitely whole foods.
Yes, whole foods. And I've always talked about, even beyond this, colorful foods. Yeah. Because colorful foods are full of phytochemicals, and those phytochemicals may not be on the World Health Organization list of vitamins and minerals that are essential, but carotenoids, flavonoids, polyphenols, those colors are antioxidants, and they're also triggering all sorts of things in the body. They're actually, food is information. My wife's a food scientist, and she always reminds me that food is information. The more color in your diet, the better. Yeah.
That was a great summary about the glymphatic system, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
As I say, just last weekend we had the big dementia conference, and the glymphatic system, was brought up. Very interesting that during slow wave sleep, the pulsations of the glymphatic fluid are time locked with the slow waves of sleep. So you can actually measure the electrical slow waves, and that correlates with the pulsations. Fascinating.
It's incredible, isn't it?
But as far as brain health, one thing that's often left out is most of our human brain is prefrontal lobes, which is all our social brain. And that's what our brains do. So much work, we burn so much glucose in our brains with social brains. And during the pandemic, those of us that treat dementia saw a huge spike in cognitive problems because of the isolation. Yes. And people always say, "Oh, what should I do to exercise my brain? Should I do Sudoku?" I go, "Yeah, do Sudoku all you want. You still won't remember what you had for breakfast, but you'll be good at Sudoku." Because we need socialization. That is the best exercise for our brain. Socialization is so important, and with the internet and everybody, sitting in front, trolling, whoever they want to troll on the internet, that's not social interaction. And people's brains are getting worse because of the lack of socialization. And so I think it's really important if you want to, I'm just going to sit at home and watch TV instead of go out with my friends. You are doing brain damage when you sit alone and don't socialize. It's really super important, and I think it's really neglected.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And one thing that kind of reminds me of that is there are blue zones around the world, right? And I have, my wife and I just recently went to Okinawa, to the Ogimi village, where the percentage of centenarians, in the population is really high. And it's not just their nutrition, it's not just their exercise, but that sociality, their connection with their family, their self-value because of their position in the community, that is all part of healthy aging. Yeah.
Good question. Thank you, Dr. Bartlett. It's always so delightful to hear you speak, make the science, it's so easy to understandable. So when you mention about the sleep, I want to see that we have so many scientists here, or researchers, whoever is interested, because clinically, I treat patients with acupuncture, right? So during that 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and many of the patients will wake up, they will say, "I get the best sleep always on your table." So I'm just thinking, could we measure it, somehow the ways, because this is very interesting, because currently there are so many ways, cancer prevention, but weight management is a big part. And don't quote me wrong, I still write Ozempic, but every time I do that, I'm guilty. I said, could we do something naturally, right? If the sleep is a part of a decreased cortisol, there are so many ways, right? But if we can get that deep sleep, so we get the lymphatic, the cleaning of our brains, this will be remarkable. So many scientists here. Where's Dr. Shanaz somewhere? Okay, oh yes, so let's do something about that. Okay,
yeah, I love that.
You.
And there's a couple of things in that too that I didn't mention. So if you're not sleeping well, what does Americans in general do? They say, well, I need an OTC sleep aid, or I need an Ambien or something. The research is actually showing that they sedate you, but they're actually robbing you of REM sleep and deep sleep. And REM sleep is just important because this is an opportunity to sort of it's basically your overnight mental health therapist, according to actually Matthew Walker, who's right here at Berkeley, right? So yes. He's moved again? Okay. So, read his book, Why We Sleep. It's amazing what's going on when we sleep. And the other thing is, you mentioned like GLP, et cetera, maybe microdosing, but you need to make sure that they're doing their resistance training so they keep their muscle. But when you don't sleep, like even for a couple of days properly, like less than 7 or 8 hours, your entire metabolic panel looks like that of a diabetic. And so ghrelin is up, so you're more hungry. Leptin is down, so you don't sort of have the so you're snacking more, you're eating more. So there is a natural approach to Ozempic, right? So that's just it takes time and it's hard, but I think there are ways.
Thank you.
How do you promote deep sleep other than avoid caffeine?
Okay, so the question was, how do we promote deep sleep other than avoiding caffeine, etc.? This boils down to 2 words: sleep hygiene. You've heard of this before, right? But it does take discipline. When you are looking at light, it's sending a signal through the eyes to the brain and inhibiting melatonin, the endogenous melatonin. So we need to put away our phones and turn down the lights like at least half an hour before bed. Remember, no caffeine. It's so hard because you are fighting dopamine, right? For the neurologists here. Like, I love the scrolling, the news channel or whatever it is. And so now it's more than just turning off the light. It's like, oh man, what am I missing? It takes discipline. But, cooler room, dark, less noise, like all of those things, it becomes now a ritual of sleep hygiene to help you get into that deep sleep habit. So, yeah. Yeah, that too. Especially the ones that put you to sleep. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful speech for us. Lots of good content. I think we could keep all of these people here forever. It'd be all right. I want to remind you that we are going to have, I think all, if not most of the